There is a photograph taken in the summer of 1889 that shows 11 people standing in front of a farmhouse in the Missouri Ozarks. The house is modest, weathered by wind and rain, with a sagging porch and windows that reflect the afternoon sun like hollow eyes. The people in the photograph are the Marlowe family. Mother, father, 7 children ranging from infant to 19 years old, and 2 elderly relatives whose exact connection to the family was never clearly established. They stand rigidly, as was common for photographs of that era, their faces carrying that particular blank intensity that comes from holding still for long exposures. But there is something else in their expressions, something that becomes more apparent the longer you look at the image. It is not quite fear. It is not quite resignation. It is something that exists between those two states, a kind of awareness that what is coming cannot be stopped. 3 weeks after this photograph was taken, the entire Marlowe family vanished. Not fled, not murdered, vanished. The house was left exactly as it had been. Plates were still on the table with food dried upon them. Clothes were still folded in drawers. The livestock were still in their pens, growing thin with hunger until neighbors finally came to investigate. But the Marlowe family was gone, and in the 135 years since that August morning when they disappeared, no one has ever discovered where they went or why. This is not a story about a family that left. This is a story about a family that was taken, and about the thing in their blood that marked them for removal. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Marlowe family arrived in Howell County, Missouri, in the winter of 1871. They came from Kentucky, though records before that point become unclear, fragmentary, suggesting a pattern of movement that stretched back generations. The family consisted of Daniel Marlowe, age 34, his wife Constance, age 31, and 3 children at that time. Daniel purchased 80 acres of rocky hillside land for almost nothing, the kind of property that no one else wanted because the soil was poor and the terrain difficult. The nearest town was West Plains, approximately 9 miles to the south over roads that became impassable in winter. The Marlowes built their farmhouse in a hollow surrounded by dense forest, where the morning fog would settle so thick you couldn't see 20 feet in any direction. Their nearest neighbors, a family named Drucker, lived 3 miles away and rarely saw the Marlowes except at the general store or occasionally at church, though the Marlowes' attendance was sporadic at best. From the beginning, there was something unsettling about the Marlowe family, though the people who knew them struggled to articulate what it was. Samuel Drucker, the patriarch of the neighboring family, wrote in a letter to his brother in 1873 that the Marlowes were proper folk, but haunted by something unseen. He described seeing Daniel Marlowe standing in his fields at dusk, not working, just standing and staring at the tree line as if waiting for something to emerge. Drucker's wife, Martha, told other women at church that Constance Marlowe had a sadness about her that went deeper than ordinary grief, that she moved through her days like a woman who knew she was living on borrowed time. The Marlowe children were quiet, unnaturally so. They didn't play loudly. They didn't run or shout. When they came to town, they stayed close to their parents, watching everything with wide, careful eyes. In 1874, Constance gave birth to twin boys, bringing the number of children to 5. A local midwife, a woman named Esther Gaines, attended the birth and later told the doctor in West Plains that something had troubled her about the delivery. The twins were healthy, but Constance had wept throughout the entire labor, not from pain but from what appeared to be despair. Esther said Constance had whispered something while holding the newborns, words that Esther couldn't quite make out but that sounded like forgive me, repeated over and over. When Esther asked what was wrong, Constance had looked at her with hollow eyes and said, "They're marked now. They're all marked." Esther asked what she meant. Constance wouldn't explain. The midwife left the Marlowe house deeply unsettled and told several people in town about the incident. Though most dismissed it, as the ravings of a woman exhausted from childbirth. The years passed. The Marlowe family continued their isolated existence. They grew enough food to survive, kept a few animals, and rarely interacted with others. In 1878, tragedy struck when their oldest son, Matthew, age 13, drowned in the creek that ran through their property. The circumstances were strange. Matthew was an experienced swimmer. The creek was shallow that time of year, barely 3 feet deep, and yet he'd somehow drowned. His body was found by his father, face down in the water, with no signs of struggle or injury. The county coroner, Dr. Benjamin Walsh, examined the body and found nothing to explain the death. No water in the lungs suggested Matthew might have died before entering the water, but there was no evidence of what had killed him. Walsh ruled it an accidental drowning, but he noted in his private journal, which still exists in the Howell County Historical Society, that the boy's face had an expression of pure terror frozen upon it, something Walsh had never seen in a drowning victim before. After Matthew's death, the Marlowe family became even more withdrawn. They stopped attending church entirely. They came to town only when absolutely necessary. Samuel Drucker rode over to offer his condolences a few days after the funeral and found Daniel Marlowe standing in the exact spot where his son had drowned, staring down at the water. When Drucker spoke to him, Daniel didn't respond at first. Then, without looking up, he said, "It's in the water, it's in the blood, it's in all of us." Drucker asked what he meant. Daniel finally looked at him, and Drucker later told his wife that Daniel's eyes looked dead, like he was already gone even though he was still standing there. Daniel said, "We can't escape it, we never could, it follows the line." Then he walked back to his house, leaving Drucker standing alone by the creek. 2 more children were born to the Marlowes in the years that followed, bringing the total to 7 after Matthew's death. Constance's health began to decline. She was seen in town occasionally, looking gaunt and aged beyond her years. In 1885, when she would have been 45, she looked 70. A doctor who examined her at Daniel's insistence found no specific illness, just a general wasting, as if life itself was draining out of her. The doctor prescribed tonics and rest, but nothing helped. Constance continued to fade. During one of her rare conversations with another woman recorded in a diary kept by the woman's daughter, Constance said something chilling. She said, "Every generation pays the price. My children will pay it. Their children would have paid it. The bloodline carries the debt, and the debt must be settled." When pressed to explain, Constance had broken down weeping and refused to say more. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In the spring of 1889, strange occurrences began to be reported around the Marlowe property. Samuel Drucker's son, Thomas, told his father that he'd been hunting in the woods near the Marlowe farm and had heard voices coming from the hollow where the Marlowes lived. Not regular conversation, but chanting, low and rhythmic, in words he didn't recognize. Thomas said he'd hidden and watched from a distance as the entire Marlowe family walked out of their house in the middle of the night and stood in a circle in their yard. They didn't move. They just stood there for what Thomas estimated was 2 hours, from midnight until nearly dawn, perfectly still, facing inward. Then, as the sun began to rise, they turned as one and walked back into the house. Thomas told his father he'd never been so frightened in his life, that there was something unnatural about the way they moved, synchronized and purposeful. Other reports followed. A traveling merchant passing through the area in June of 1889 stopped at the Marlowe farm to water his horse and found the entire family working in their garden in complete silence. Not unusual in itself, but when he called out a greeting, none of them responded. They didn't even look up. They continued working as if he wasn't there. The merchant, unsettled, left without watering his horse. He told people in West Plains that it was like the Marlowes were asleep, moving and working but not really present. A woman named Rebecca Stiles, who lived 4 miles from the Marlowe property, reported that her children had been playing near the creek one afternoon when they saw 2 of the Marlowe children standing on the opposite bank, just standing and staring at them. Rebecca's children had called out and waved, but the Marlowe children didn't respond. They stood there for several minutes, then turned and walked back into the woods without a word. The most disturbing account came from Reverend Josiah Thorne, the minister of the Methodist Church in West Plains. In July of 1889, Thorne decided to visit the Marlowe family, concerned about their absence from services and worried about their spiritual well-being. He rode out to their farm on a Thursday afternoon. He found the family at home, but when he knocked on the door, Daniel Marlowe opened it only partway and blocked the entrance with his body. Thorne asked if he could come in and speak with the family. Daniel said no. Thorne, taken aback, asked if everything was all right. Daniel stared at him for a long moment, then said, "We're preparing." Thorne asked what they were preparing for. Daniel said, "The completion, it's almost time." Thorne asked him to explain, but Daniel simply closed the door. Thorne stood on the porch for a moment, considering whether to knock again, when he heard something that made his blood run cold. From inside the house came the sound of weeping, multiple voices, children and adults both, all crying together. But beneath the crying was something else, a sound Thorne later described as humming, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to come from the very walls of the house. Thorne fled and never returned. In early August of 1889, Daniel Marlowe came into West Plains alone. He went to the general store and purchased an unusual quantity of lamp oil, several bundles of candles, and a large quantity of salt. The store owner, Gordon Presley, later testified that Daniel seemed calm but distracted, as if his mind was elsewhere. Presley asked if he was planning something, and Daniel said, "It's the 15th. It has to be the 15th. Presley asked what was happening on the 15th. Daniel looked at him and said, "The same thing that happened to my father's family, the same thing that happened to his father's family, back and back and back. We carry it in our blood, and eventually it comes to collect." Presley, unsure how to respond to this cryptic statement, simply completed the transaction. Daniel loaded his purchases onto his wagon and drove back toward his farm. That was the last time anyone saw any member of the Marlowe family alive. On August 23, 1889, 8 days after the date Daniel had mentioned, Samuel Drucker rode over to the Marlowe property to borrow a tool. He'd seen no smoke from their chimney for several days, which was unusual, and wanted to check on them. When he arrived, the farmhouse was silent. No chickens in the yard, no sounds of activity. The livestock in the barn were distressed, obviously hadn't been fed or watered in days. Drucker called out. No answer. He approached the house and knocked on the door. It swung open at his touch, unlocked. Inside, the house was in perfect order. The table was set for a meal that had never been eaten. Bread sat on the counter, molded but otherwise undisturbed. The beds were made. Clothes were folded, but there were no people. Drucker searched every room. He checked the barn, the outbuildings, the root cellar. Empty. He rode back to his own farm and gathered several neighbors, and they spent the rest of the day searching the surrounding woods and hills. They found no trace of the Marlowe family. The county sheriff, a man named Walter Grime, was notified the next day. He arrived with 2 deputies and conducted a thorough investigation. They found several things that deepened the mystery. In the main room of the house, the furniture had been pushed against the walls, clearing a large space in the center. On the floor, drawn in what appeared to be ash mixed with salt, was a circular symbol approximately 8 feet in diameter. Inside the circle were markings that no one could identify, geometric patterns, and what might have been letters in an unknown alphabet. Around the circle, at regular intervals, were 11 candles, burned down to stubs. The lamp oil Daniel had purchased was gone, the containers empty. In the bedroom shared by the children, every piece of clothing belonging to each child was laid out on the beds, arranged neatly, as if the children were still in them but had somehow vanished from inside their own clothes. On the mantel in the main room, propped against a tin cup, was a piece of paper with a single sentence written in careful script. "The debt is paid in full." Sheriff Grime questioned everyone in the area. No one had seen or heard anything unusual on or around August 15th. No one had seen the Marlowe family leave. No witnesses reported seeing anyone approach the Marlowe property. The family had simply ceased to exist. Grimes sent inquiries to surrounding counties, to Kentucky where the family had originated, even to authorities in Illinois and Arkansas. No sightings, no bodies, nothing. The Marlowe family had vanished completely, leaving behind only their possessions and that cryptic message. Grimes' official report, filed in September of 1889, concluded that the family had likely fled during the night for reasons unknown, possibly related to debts or legal troubles. But Grimes' personal notes, discovered years later in a trunk of his belongings, told a different story. He wrote that he believed something had happened to the Marlowe family, something that defied rational explanation, and that the symbol on the floor and the way the house had been left suggested they hadn't left voluntarily, but had been taken. The Marlowe farmhouse stood empty for years. No one wanted to buy the property. Stories began to circulate about strange lights seen in the windows at night, about the sound of children crying carried on the wind, about people who ventured too close feeling an overwhelming urge to flee. In 1892, a family from Springfield considered purchasing the land, but changed their minds after spending a single night in the house. They left before dawn and refused to discuss what had happened, saying only that they would never return. The property was eventually seized for unpaid taxes in 1895 and sold at auction for almost nothing to a speculator who never developed it. The house gradually fell into ruin, the roof collapsing in 1902, the walls following over the next decade. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The mystery might have ended there, another unsolved disappearance in a time and place where such things were more common than people today realize. But in 1908, a discovery was made that reopened the case and revealed a pattern far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. A historian named Douglas Merritt was researching early settlement patterns in Missouri and came across the Marlowe case in old newspaper archives. Intrigued, he began investigating further. He tracked the Marlowe family backward through records, following their movements from Missouri to Kentucky to Virginia to Pennsylvania. What he found was extraordinary and terrifying. The Marlowe family, or families using variations of that name, Marlowe, had a documented history stretching back to the early 1700s in America and possibly further in Europe. And in every generation, at some point, the entire family would vanish. Merritt documented 19 instances of Marlowe family disappearances over a span of approximately 170 years. In 1728, a family named Marlowe disappeared from a settlement in Pennsylvania, all 7 members gone overnight with no explanation. In 1751, the Marlowe family of Virginia vanished, 12 people including 3 generations, leaving behind a farmhouse that neighbors described as having a strange smell, like burning metal. In 1779, during the Revolution, a family named Marlowe serving with the Continental Army disappeared from their encampment. 14 soldiers went to look for them and found their tent empty, their belongings undisturbed, but the family gone. The pattern continued through the 1800s. Every 20 to 30 years, somewhere in America, a Marlowe family would disappear completely, always leaving behind the same clues. A house in perfect order, belongings untouched, and often some kind of symbol or marking that suggested ritual preparation. Merritt published his findings in a historical journal in 1909. The article attracted attention from other researchers, and soon more evidence came to light. A professor of folklore at the University of Missouri, Dr. Helena Vance, discovered references to the Marlowe family in European records dating back to the 1500s. In a German town called Mulheim, a family named Marlowe had been accused of witchcraft in 1543. The charges were specific. The family was said to practice bloodline magic, a form of hereditary curse that passed from generation to generation. According to the trial records, the Marlowes claimed they were not practicing magic but were victims of it, that their family had been cursed centuries before for reasons lost to time, and that every few generations the curse would manifest and the family would be collected as payment. The Marlowes were found guilty and sentenced to death, but before the sentence could be carried out, the entire family disappeared from their prison cell. The guards reported hearing strange sounds during the night, a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and when they checked the cell at dawn, it was empty. Dr. Vance found similar stories scattered through European folklore. In England, in Scotland, and France, there were tales of families cursed to disappear, families marked by blood debt that could never be fully paid. The details varied, but the core elements remained consistent: isolation, strange behavior in the weeks before disappearance, ritual preparation, and finally, complete vanishing. Vance theorized that the Marlowe family, or whatever they had been called in earlier centuries, had been fleeing this curse for generations, moving from place to place, hopping to escape what pursued them. But the curse, or whatever it was, always found them. The pattern suggested a cycle, roughly 25 to 30 years between manifestations, tied perhaps to specific generations or ages. When the family reached a certain size, a certain configuration, the curse would activate and they would be taken. The question that haunted every researcher who studied the Marlowe case was, taken where? And by what? There were no bodies, no evidence of violence, no indication of where the families went. Some theorized they committed mass suicide and their bodies were hidden by accomplices, but this didn't explain the lack of any witnesses or the consistency of the pattern across centuries and continents. Others suggested the families staged their disappearances to escape debts or persecution, but again, the evidence didn't support this. The families left behind valuable possessions. They vanished despite being watched by suspicious neighbors, and in every case, there were strange phenomena reported: symbols, sounds, lights, that suggested something beyond ordinary human agency. In 1914, a psychiatric researcher named Dr. Maurice Langford proposed a radical theory. He suggested that the Marlowe family suffered from a hereditary mental illness that caused mass delusions and compelled them to engage in ritual suicide. He theorized that the families, gripped by shared psychosis, would plan their own disappearances and carry them out with meticulous coordination, hiding their bodies in ways that ensured they'd never be found. Langford's theory was taken seriously for several years, but it failed to account for several key facts: the consistency of the pattern across unrelated branches of the family who had no contact with each other, the physical evidence of ritual preparation, and most importantly, the testimony of witnesses who reported supernatural phenomena associated with the disappearances. The most significant witness account came to light in 1922. An elderly woman named Sarah Pruitt, living in a nursing home in Springfield, Missouri, told a visiting relative about something she'd witnessed as a child in 1889. Sarah had been 9 years old that summer, living with her family on a farm adjacent to the Drucker property, making her one of the closest neighbors to the Marlowes. On the night of August 15, 1889, Sarah had been unable to sleep. She'd gone to her bedroom window to look at the stars and had seen something that terrified her so completely she'd hidden under her bed for the rest of the night. She said she'd seen lights at the Marlowe farm, not lamplight but something else, something that moved and pulsed. She said the lights were green, a sickly green that hurt to look at, and they seemed to be converging on the Marlowe house from the surrounding woods. Sarah said she'd seen shapes in those lights, tall figures that weren't quite human, moving with an unsettling fluidity. She said the lights had surrounded the house, growing brighter and brighter until she couldn't look anymore, and then suddenly everything went dark. Complete darkness, darker than any normal night. When dawn came, Sarah's father had gone to check on the Marlowes and found them gone. Sarah had never told anyone this story as a child, afraid she wouldn't be believed or would be punished for lying. But as an old woman facing death, she wanted someone to know what she'd seen. Her relative, A schoolteacher named Margaret Prout was initially skeptical but was struck by the specificity of Sarah's account and the genuine fear still evident in the old woman's voice decades later. Margaret reported the story to the Howell County Historical Society, and it was recorded in their archives. Whether Sarah's testimony was reliable is impossible to verify, but it added another layer to the mystery. The suggestion that the Marlowe disappearances were not voluntary, that the families were taken by something external, something that came for them when certain conditions were met. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In the decades following the Marlowe disappearance, the site of their farm became a place of dark fascination. Despite its remote location, people ventured there, drawn by curiosity or morbid interest. Many reported strange experiences. A common report was the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking every movement. Several people claimed to have heard voices coming from the ruins of the house, speaking in whispers too low to understand. In 1931, a group of university students conducted an overnight investigation of the site, hoping to document paranormal activity. 2 of the students left before midnight, too frightened to continue. The remaining 3 stayed until dawn. In their written report, they described experiencing overwhelming feelings of dread, seeing moving shadows that had no source, and hearing what they described as a low, resonant humming that seemed to vibrate through their bodies. One student wrote that around 3 in the morning, he'd seen a figure standing in what remained of the doorway to the house, the silhouette of a man who matched descriptions of Daniel Marlowe. The figure stood for perhaps 30 seconds, then simply faded away. The property changed hands several more times over the years. In 1947, a farmer named Eugene Haskins purchased the land with the intention of clearing it and planting crops. He hired workers to remove the remnants of the Marlowe house and plow the fields. The workers refused to continue after 3 days, reporting that their equipment constantly malfunctioned on that specific piece of ground, that they felt sick when working there, and that they'd all experienced nightmares about being buried alive. Haskins attempted to do the work himself but gave up after his tractor caught fire for no apparent reason. He sold the property at a loss a year later. The subsequent owner left it undeveloped, and it eventually reverted to forest. In the 1960s and 70s, as interest in the paranormal grew, the Marlowe case attracted attention from various investigators. Multiple teams attempted to document supernatural activity at the site. Results were mixed. Some reported significant anomalies, temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic disturbances, photographic irregularities. Others found nothing. The most thorough investigation was conducted in 1974 by a team led by parapsychologist Dr. Raymond Keller. Keller's team spent 2 weeks at the site, using various measurement instruments and conducting seances. They reported several strange occurrences: recording devices that would inexplicably stop working, compasses that spun wildly, and during one seance, what they claimed was contact with a female spirit who identified herself as Constance Marlowe. According to Keller's notes, the spirit communicated that the family had been taken to fulfill an ancient pact, that their bloodline had been claimed by something that existed outside normal reality, and that others with the Marlowe blood would eventually face the same fate. When asked if the family suffered, the spirit allegedly responded, "We are nowhere. We are nothing. We are waiting." The seance ended abruptly when one of the participants became hysterical and had to be removed from the site. The authenticity of Keller's findings has been debated extensively. Skeptics point out that his methods were not scientifically rigorous and that seances are notoriously unreliable. Believers argue that Keller was a respected researcher whose other work was sound, and that dismissing his findings out of hand is premature. Regardless of whether his specific claims are true, they reflect a consistent theme in all investigations of the Marlowe case: the sense that something unnatural occurred there, something that left a permanent mark on that place. The most unsettling development in the Marlowe case came in 1986, almost exactly 100 years after the original disappearance. A genealogist named Patricia Marlowe, no known relation to the disappeared family but interested in the shared surname, conducted extensive research into all American families named Marlowe or its variants. She compiled a database of thousands of individuals and began looking for patterns. What she discovered was deeply disturbing. Approximately every 25 to 30 years, somewhere in America, a family with the Marlowe surname or a close variant would experience what Patricia called catastrophic disappearance events. Not always the entire family, but always multiple members, always with similar characteristics: isolation in the weeks before, strange behavior, and then vanishing without trace. Patricia documented 12 such events between 1889 and 1986. The most recent had occurred in 1983, when a family of 6 named Marlowe disappeared from their farm in rural Arkansas. The circumstances were nearly identical to the 1889 Missouri case. House left in order, belongings untouched, no witnesses, no bodies found. Patricia's research suggested something horrifying. The curse, pattern, or whatever it was still active. It hadn't ended with the Marlowe family of Missouri. It continued through other branches of the bloodline, other families who perhaps didn't even know they were connected to the cursed lineage. Patricia attempted to warn families with the Marlowe surname about her findings. Most ignored her, assuming she was mentally unstable. A few took her seriously enough to research their own genealogies. What several of them discovered was that yes, they did have connections, distant but real, to the families that had disappeared. This created a moral dilemma. If the curse or pattern was real and tied to bloodline, were these families in danger? Should they change their names, move to cities where isolation was impossible, have no children to avoid passing on whatever made them targets? Patricia Marlowe died in 1994, but her research was preserved by her daughter and eventually donated to several historical societies and genealogical organizations. Researchers continue to track families with the Marlowe name, looking for patterns, trying to predict where the next disappearance might occur. So far, the pattern holds. Approximately every 25 to 30 years somewhere, a Marlowe family vanishes. The most recent documented case was in 2009 in rural Montana. A family of 8, surnamed Marlowe, disappeared from their isolated ranch. The circumstances matched all previous cases. The FBI investigated, found no evidence of foul play or voluntary flight, and eventually classified it as a cold case. The family has never been found. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? So we return to the question that has no answer, the question that has haunted researchers for over a century. What is taking the Marlowe families? Is it a curse in the traditional sense, some supernatural force that claims them as payment for an ancient transgression? Is it something in their genetics, a biological imperative that compels them to engage in coordinated disappearance? Is it human agency, some secret society or cult that hunts families of this bloodline for reasons we can't understand? Or is it something else entirely, something that exists outside our categories of explanation, something that we lack the framework to even properly conceptualize? The evidence points in multiple directions and nowhere at all. The consistency of the pattern suggests deliberate action, but the mechanism remains invisible. The family preparation rituals suggest awareness and acceptance, but the terror reported by witnesses suggests this was not willing participation. The complete lack of bodies or physical evidence suggests something beyond merely clever disposal. The generational nature, stretching across centuries and continents, suggests something tied to bloodline, to inheritance, to something carried in the very cells of these families. There is one more piece to this story, discovered only recently, that provides no answers but deepens the horror. In 2018, A researcher examining old property records in Howell County came across something that had been missed by previous investigators. The land where the Marlowe family lived in Missouri, that specific 80 acres in that specific hollow, had been purchased and abandoned 15 times before the Marlowes bought it in 1871. 15 different families had tried to settle that land, and every single one had left within a year, citing feelings of unease, bad luck, or in several cases, seeing things they couldn't explain. The researcher cross-referenced these families with genealogical databases and made a chilling discovery. 12 of the 15 families had surnames that were linguistic variants or anagrams of Marlowe. Families named Loamer, Rowalm, Mallower. Names that seemed different but that, when analyzed, shared the same linguistic roots, the same phonetic patterns. It suggested that the land itself was somehow tied to the curse, or that families carrying the blood were drawn to specific places, places where the barrier between whatever took them and our reality was thin. The original site of the Marlowe farm in Missouri still exists. The land is privately owned and posted against trespassing, but people still venture there, drawn by the story, hoping to experience something paranormal or solve the mystery that has eluded investigators for over a century. Most report nothing more than an ordinary piece of overgrown Ozark hillside. But some, a troubling number, report experiences similar to those documented historically. The feeling of being watched. The sound of voices in the wind. The sense that something is waiting there, patient and inevitable. In 2015, a man hiking in the area reported finding what appeared to be freshly drawn symbols on flat stones, symbols that matched descriptions from historical accounts of the Marlowe case. Who drew them and why remains unknown. The county sheriff investigated but found no evidence of recent human activity in that area. The Marlowe case remains officially unsolved. The FBI has a file on the family, containing reports of multiple disappearances spanning over a century, but the case is classified as historical and not actively investigated. Local law enforcement in areas where Marlowe families have disappeared continue to maintain records but have no leads. Private researchers continue to track families with the Marlowe name, documenting their locations, watching for signs of the pattern repeating. There is a registry now, maintained by genealogical societies, of families who share the Marlowe bloodline. Some families on this registry are aware of their inclusion, others are not. Some families have taken precautions, whatever precautions one can take against something so poorly understood. They stay in cities, avoid isolation, maintain constant communication with extended family. Whether these measures will prove effective remains to be seen. The pattern suggests they won't. The pattern suggests that when the time comes, isolation or publicity makes no difference. The marked families are taken regardless. And so the mystery endures, as dark and impenetrable as the Missouri Hollow, where the Marlowe family stood in their doorway one August morning in 1889 and looked out at something approaching. Something they'd been waiting for all their lives because their parents had told them it would come, as their parents had been told, as their parents before them, back through generations to a time and place where something was done or something was promised, or something was taken that created a debt that must be paid in blood, in disappearance, in the complete erasure of families from the face of the earth. The Marlowe family is gone. But the bloodline continues, scattered through America under various names, carrying forward whatever it is that makes them targets, and somewhere in some isolated place, another family with that cursed inheritance is living their lives, raising their children, not knowing or perhaps knowing too well that one day, perhaps soon, perhaps not for another generation, they will feel the call, they will prepare. They will draw their symbols and light their candles and wait for what comes to claim them as it has claimed all the others, and they will vanish like smoke, like breath, like they were never there at all, leaving behind only empty houses and questions that can never be answered, and the terrible knowledge that the pattern continues, that it has always continued, that it will continue until the last drop of Marlowe blood has been collected, and the debt, whatever it is, wherever it came from, is finally paid in full.